For our next unit, we are going to do an introduction to the work of Saint Bonaventure. So before we do that, we should get a brief explanation of the life of Saint Bonaventure. So let's start in the middle of the story. On 2nd February 1257, Brother Bonaventure was appointed Minister General in charge of the Franciscan order. So he was the CEO of the Franciscans, so to speak. This act of ecclesiastical preferment effectively split his life into two halves, the burdens of the ecclesiastical administrator replacing the leisure of the scholar. He is thought to have been 40 years old at the time, the minimum age for a minister general, giving him a birth date of 1217. Bonaventure was born Giovanni di Fidanza in Bagnoregio in Tuscany. He himself attests that he was healed miraculously as a child by the intervention of Francis of Assisi, shortly after the saint's death on 3rd October 1226. Quote, "When I was a boy, as I still vividly remember, I was snatched from the jaws of death by his invocation and merits." He did not rush to join the Franciscans, but matriculated as a layman in the arts faculty at the University of Paris around 1235, and proceeded all the way to the Master of Arts around 1243. So that would be today equivalent to getting his PhD. The arts curriculum at Paris then consisted of the 7 liberal arts, supplemented by some works of Aristotle. It was heavily weighted in favor of the trivium, so grammar, rhetoric, logic. You've heard this before. Teaching and the quadrivium, so those would be the 4 mathematical and scientific disciplines. That was somewhat limited due to a prohibition on the use of Aristotle's work in science classes at Paris in 1210. Some of the masters of art, such as Roger Bacon and Richard Rufus, were teaching Aristotle science, but the requirements for becoming a master were only required the old logic, the new logic, and Aristotle's On the Soul. The use of his entire science and metaphysics as required for graduation, that only appears in 1255, 2 years before Bonaventure left. So Aristotle was used in the curriculum at this point, but he was still controversial. So his writings reflect this education. He was a master of logic and rhetoric, and he was less deeply read in Aristotelian philosophy and Islamic philosophy than his contemporaries in the Dominican order, Saint Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas. So, about the time that young Giovanni began to study arts, Alexander of Hales, the master of theology at the University of Paris, who began the practice of the commentary and the sentences of Peter Lombard. You remember we talked about this the first quarter. You probably don't remember, it's been a while, but if you do remember, we talked about this. He became a Franciscan, and because he became a Franciscan, the Franciscans now had a chair at the University of Paris in theology. The Dominicans had 2 chairs. They got 2 of them during a university strike. So Alexander of Hales held St. Bonaventure in very high regard and said that, quote, in him Adam seemed not to have sinned. Giovanni, he took the Franciscan habit in 1243 or 1244, taking the name Bonaventure to celebrate his good fortune under St. Francis and Alexander of Hales. So if St. Bonaventure were around today, he took the name Lucky. That's what he was calling himself. But saying it in Italian sounds more sophisticated. So Bonaventure attended lectures and disputations in theology from 1243 to 1248. Writing about 1280, the Franciscan chronicler Salimbene said, Brother John of Parma, who was the Minister General of the Franciscans, again, like the guy in charge, gave the license to Brother Bonaventure of Bagnoregio to read at Paris, which he had never yet done because he was not yet installed in a chair. He then read the whole Gospel of St. Luke, a commentary that is very beautiful and complete. This was in 1248. So when it says read, that means to study it. He had obviously read the Bible before then, read the Gospel before then, but he produced the study in 1248. This entry refers to Bonaventure's Cursoriae lectures as Bachelor of the Bible, 1248 to 1250. So he got his bachelor's degree by writing a commentary on the Gospel of Luke. So that's how the university system worked then. Things have changed a bit. From 1250 to 1252, he commented on the sentences, as one did back then to become a master. And when he became a master, he revised his commentary. He revised the commentary. In 1252 to 1253, he was a formed bachelor, as it was called, of theology, performing the 3 duties of a master: lecturing on the Bible, engaging in disputations, and preaching. In 1253, the masters and students of the University of Paris all went on strike, except for the friars. The 2 Dominicans and William of Melitton, the Franciscan, continued to teach and refused to take an oath of loyalty to the university corporation, for which they were expelled from the University of Masters, an action defended by the university in a letter of 4th February. So, student riots and strikes, they were not invented in the 1960s. They did it in the Middle Ages too. So, Bonaventure received his licentia docendi, his teaching license, by Easter of 1254, in the midst of this conflict. He assumed the Franciscan chair in theology immediately, but taught only at the Franciscan convent, unrecognized by the university. Bonaventure performed all 3 tasks of a master of theology from 1254 to 1257. He revised his commentary on Luke and composed commentaries on John and Ecclesiastes. He also held 3 sets of disputed questions. The questions on the knowledge of Christ, which develop his illumination theory of knowledge, we might talk about that a little bit, probably came out of his inception as master in 1254. The questions on the mystery of the Trinity, which elaborated his view of God, were likely the last ones he wrote. Both were composed in a lofty style that gives no evidence of the conflict embroiling Paris at the time. He did his job, he wrote the books, you wouldn't have known there were strikes going on. The 3rd set of disputed questions, however, were on evangelical perfection and consisted in a defense of the friars' way of life, under attack by non-mendicant masters led by William of Saint Amour. So the lifestyle of the Franciscans was very controversial in the Middle Ages. We tend to think, because today we see them as just part of the church, we don't think that it could have been controversial. But in that time and place in history, it was a very controversial way to live, because it was neither the traditional way of life in the monastery, nor was it the traditional way of life of a parish priest. It was something in between, and they were also annoying everybody because they were a bunch of beggars, and they probably smelled bad. People did bathe quite often in the Middle Ages. If you know this, don't listen to what you hear on TV. But I can't imagine these mendicants did that much. It doesn't seem very penitential to bathe. All right, so back to the story. In October 1256, Pope Alexander IV ordered the secular masters at Paris to accept Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas in their rightful places of Master of Theology, but it was not until August of 1257 they did so. So he knew Thomas Aquinas. They didn't agree on a lot of stuff, but they were co-workers, they were friends. But 6 months earlier, Bonaventure had been appointed Minister General. In addition to the normal magisterial writings, Bonaventure also wrote on the retracing of the arts to theology while he was master, and probably in 1257, while leaving the university, he managed to compose his Breviloquium, a short reading which contains an outline, the main theses of a theological summa that would never be composed. So he was going to write his own summa. We mostly talk about Aquinas' Summa Theologica, but that was a common genre of literature in medieval philosophy. Thomas Aquinas was not the only one who wrote one. He just wrote the most famous one. Bonaventure never got around to writing his, but you could read the Summa of Albert the Great if you had a mind to. And plenty of others. I'm blanking on the names, though. Anyway, so from this point on, Bonaventure's writing reflected the needs of the order, but he did not cast aside his philosophical mind. So at this point, he was writing to fulfill the needs of the Franciscans, which were not the same as that of a university in a big city. But they weren't incompatible either. He did use his philosophical training for this purpose. Um, so Bonaventure quickly set a firm direction for the order in an encyclical letter to all the friars on 23rd April 1257, which admonished them to recover the somewhat tarnished luster of the order. The Minister General followed with 3 tracts written in 1259 to 1260 for the spiritual edification of the friars, a soliloquy about 4 mental exercises, the Tree of Life, and the Triple Way. I think I read the Tree of Life. I forget what it was about, but I'm sure it was pretty good. But Bonaventure's most influential work over the centuries was composed at this time. For Francis's feast day in October 1259, Bonaventure visited Mount Alverna, the very place where Francis himself had received a mystical vision of Christ under the appearance of a seraph having 6 wings, and it had imprinted in his flesh the stigmata, the wounds of Christ. So he went to the mountain where St. Francis got the stigmata, and then he got an idea. Here he conceived the idea for his journey of the mind to God, the itinerarium mentis in Deum, a mental and spiritual journey to God whose basic outline, though not its details, could be understood by even the simplest friar. The journey follows the route first charted by Augustine, from the exterior world to the interior mind, and from the interior but inferior human mind to the superior mind, namely to God. Bonaventure allegorically understood the 6 wings of the angelic seraph Francis saw to stand for the 6 ways God can be approached, and therefore arranged his journey into 7 chapters. The 2 lower wings of the seraph symbolize seeing God through the footprints, signs in the subhuman world that point to God, including signs in the physical universe itself, and signs found in the sensory life humans have in common with other animals. The 2 middle wings of the seraph symbolize seeing God in his image, namely, in humans understood as bearing within their intellectual nature special signs pointing to God. Here, Bonaventure distinguished signs of God found in the natural exercise of the mind and theoretical knowledge from those found in the exercise of the practical sphere reformed by grace. So he's talking about the difference between philosophical speculation versus living it out. And living it out is the higher goal. The 2 highest wings of the seraph symbolize seeing God in himself. First, in the way reason sees God as having one divine nature, then as faith sees God in the Trinity of persons. These 3 sets of twin steps culminate in the mental and mystical transport found in mystical experience, the end of the journey. For each step, Bonaventure used material from earlier writings, but the journey, like all his later works, is only a sketch the Minister General knew he would never have the leisure to complete. The result is his writing achieves a combination of scriptural imagery, philosophic depth, mystical yearning, and density more meditative than demonstrative. That it's a bit more like poetry than it is like systematic philosophy. So when we read this, it's not going to be like what we're used to reading from Aquinas. It's a bit more abstract. But the journey does provide an appropriate outline for looking at Bonaventure's philosophy. That if you understand this, you'll get a basic idea about what Bonaventure was about and be able to see how his style differs from Aquinas and some of the big ideas. So, the general chapter of 1260 held in Narbonne, France, the first where Bonaventure presided, ratified his codification of the legal statutes under which the Franciscans lived, known as the Constitutions of Narbonne, and also asked him to write a definitive Life of St. Francis, which he did in 1261, and that's a good read if you ever have the time to do it. These 2 works set the order on a more moderate course that lasted for centuries and led Franciscans to call Bonaventure their second founder. So, with like the Life of St. Francis, Bonaventure was writing a serious biography to go against some of the literature that was spreading that was more based on legend and myth. There were heresies associated with Franciscanism, trying to say that St. Francis was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. So he was pushing against that because that's wrong. And so that when it says that they moved toward a more moderate course, I mean, that really mean going against the radical parts of the Franciscan order, which held those views, like that Francis was the Holy Spirit incarnate, or that the Pope is the Antichrist. This even the Protestants couldn't make that one up. That's a medieval radical Franciscan heresy. So he moved the Franciscans back to normal. Not that ever was the mainstream of Franciscan belief, but you need to put it into context, realize there was a lot of trouble. And now maybe you could see why the Franciscan movement was so controversial, because people were talking like that. So back to his life. For most of the period from 1257 through 1266, Bonaventure trekked through France and Italy by foot, as did all friars when they traveled. In 1266, he returned to Paris, where his friars were under attack from both conservatives in the theology faculty and from radicals in arts. Bonaventure began a series of writings devoted primarily to moral matters. Collations on the Ten Commandments, collations on the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, defense of the mendicants. While this is going on in the late 1260s, Thomas Aquinas dies, and he died a little bit before that, but he sees his own work condemned by the Bishop of Paris. In 1273, Bonaventure delivers another work, the Collations on the Hexameron. And so the last period of Bonaventure's life saw him rise to become one of the most prominent men in Christendom. During the 3-year papal vacancy from 29 November 1268 to 1 September 1271, which ended when a gang of angry laymen literally tore the roof off of the building the cardinals were meeting in so they would elect a pope already, because it had been 3 years. Bonaventure preached an important sermon in Viterbo and was probably instrumental in the invention of conclave. That this led to the reform of the papal election process after 3 years of thumb twiddling and one angry mob later. After he is said to have been offered the papacy by the electors and to have suggested Teobaldi Visconti instead. Teobaldi Visconti was elected as Pope Gregory X, and Pope Gregory X then appointed Bonaventure cardinal in 1273, and he preached on the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches, which was a major goal of the council, which had nearly been achieved. And Bonaventure suddenly fell ill on 15th July of 1274, and, quote, "At the hour of matins died Brother Bonaventure of happy memory, Bishop of Albano, who was a man eminent for his knowledge and eloquence, a man outstanding for his sanctity and acknowledged for the excellence of his life, both religious and moral. Brother Peter of Tarantasia celebrated the funeral mass and preached on the theme, 'I am saddened over you, my brother Jonathan.' There were many tears and much weeping, for the Lord had given them such grace that the hearts of all who saw him were seized with a desire for his love." And so, a few years after that, St. Bonaventure became St. Bonaventure, and he's now the doctor of the church. And so we're going to read The Journey of the Mind to God. It's a short work, but it's very rich. It's so rich that I will never do it justice, but here we are. It explains in detail how we come to know God by beginning with knowledge of the external world through our senses. If you remember Plato's Cave, you can think of this as a new and improved Christian version. So, there'll be a link on RunWeb to the reading, and I only expect you to do the first part and report on that. So it's not too much to start off with, but there is a lot in there to unpack, as you will find out with the next lecture.